Britain in the 80s had some great number one singles. Songs that summed up a moment, stretched the boundaries of what pop could be, yet have stood the test of time. Ghost Town, Don't You Want Me, Relax, West End Girls, Ride on Time. From this list, you would think the British record buying public had excellent, perfect taste. But then there are other songs where you wonder, how did this become the most popular song in the country? Whether that's being confusingly out of time, defiantly uncommercial, or offensively not very good. This is an exploration of those songs. The stories of the most bizarre UK number ones of the 1980s. Songs from films charting in the UK are not unheard of, but a film song reaching number one 10 years after the film came out is less common, especially when it has a radio play restricting word in its title. Suicide is Painless was composed by Johnny Mandel for the 1970 Robert Altman Korean War black comedy MASH. Suicide is painless. It brings on many. It was written as part of the joke, emphasizing the meaninglessness of war. And I can take or leave it if I please. A dreamy, easy acoustic guitar melody was paired with some lyrics ruminating on death that are decidedly adolescent. The game of life is hard to play, gonna lose it anyway. Quite literally, after Altman attempted to write some words to achieve what he wanted, i.e. the stupidest song ever written, and failed, he tasked his 15-year-old son with the job, who scribbled something down in 5 minutes. Is it to be or not to be? And I replied, oh, why ask me? The composition ended up as the film's opening theme, and therefore an instrumental version became the theme for the MASH TV show, which started airing in 1972. Robert Altman was paid $70,000 for directing the film. His son earned $1 million from songwriting royalties. But how did it get to number one in the UK in May 1980? In 2 words, Noel Edmonds. Though the TV show was reaching its apex of popularity due to its prominent BBC Two Wednesday evening time slot, it was Edmonds consistently playing the original film theme on his Sunday morning show on Radio 1. They created the demand for CBS to release it as a single. His morning show was the only place you were going to hear it on the radio, as no one else wanted to play it due to its radio-unfriendly title. The fact that the track reached the top spot 2 weeks after Joy Division's Ian Curtis died added some additional sourness to its victory. The single was credited to the MASH, as the original theme had been performed by a collection of LA-based session musicians. As such, they couldn't make it to the required Top of the Pops appearance, so dance troupe Legs & Co. confusingly filled in, creating tonal whiplash. It's hard to play, I'm gonna lose it anyway.
Hello, I'm Giuseppe, I got something special for you. Ready?
Joe Dolce was an Italian-American who in the late 70s moved to Australia with his wife. Less than a year later, they divorced. He was broke, and in a country that seemed to look down on his heritage. In the US, you had people like Frank Sinatra, Robert De Niro, and Joe DiMaggio, shining examples of the American dream, proudly displaying their Italian background. In Australia, there were no Italian entertainers in high esteem. Those from Southern Europe were faced with derision and slurs. Shut Up You Face was Dolce's attempt at flipping the narrative.
And the mama used to say all the time, what's the matter you? Hey, gotta no respect.
Using broken English phrases, he remembered his Sicilian grandmother saying, a cod Italian accent, and a minimalist mandolin polka backing.
What do you think you do? Why you look so sad? It's not so bad.
He became Giuseppe, a grotesque mocking stereotype, holding a mirror up to his new home's backward attitudes.
It's a nice place, shut up your face. Mama, she said it all of the time.
Catchy, no doubt, but many found it supremely irritating. And sadly, some adopted this satire as a means to laugh at foreigners. Either way, Shut Up You Face was a big deal.
It's a nice place, shut up your face. Okay, one time for mama, everybody.
In England, Terry Wogan said, "This is the worst thing I've ever heard." So the song got lots of attention. CBS flew me over to do 3 TV shows, and by the time I left, it was already at number 3. It went to number 1 in 11 countries. In the UK, it kept Ultravox's Vienna off the top for 3 weeks. Which drove Midge crazy. But keyboard player Billy Currie said, "That's a good song. I wish we'd written it." But denying Ultravox number 1 isn't the song's only dubious chart achievement. It also, for 3 weeks in February 1981, dislodged the succession of John Lennon songs from the top of the UK chart, following his death in December 1980.
What's the matter, you? Hey! Got no respect. Hey! What do you think you do?
It was replaced at number 1 by Roxy Music's cover of Jealous Guy. Do you know what the first ever UK number 1 released by an independent label is?
Love's got the world in motion, and I know what we can do. Pump up the volume, dance, dance. You spin me right round, baby, right round, like a record, baby, right round.
Factory's World in Motion, 4AD's Pump Up the Volume, and the sneakily indie You Spin Me Round Like a Record are all noble guesses. But no, predating all of these is Save Your Love by Renee and Renato.
Save your love, my darling, save your love.
Renato Pagliari was an Italian-born restaurant waiter living in Birmingham. Having impressed patrons with his impromptu opera singing, he won a place on ITV talent show New Faces in 1975 and caught the ear of songwriter John Edwards. Edwards had written a pastiche of sappy love ballads called Save Your Love that he felt Pagliari's emotive warble was perfectly suited. However, after playing the track to record labels, no one was biting. It was 7 years later the move to make the track a duet, and for Edwards to self-release the single on his own label Hollywood Records, that Save Your Love found its way to the British public under the moniker Renee and Renato. What was the kind of romantic ballad that always does well at the holidays? The reason this pop opera melange managed to get to number 1 went beyond its qualities as a pop song. In contrast to Shut Up You Face, Terry Wogan loved it and played it often on his BBC Radio 2 breakfast show. But mostly, listeners were enthralled by the central mystery of the track. Who was Renee?
Darling, I will love you endlessly.
By the time the song was released, Renato's singing partner, Hilary Lester, was trying to make it in girl group The Cover Girls, so was not available to promote Save Your Love. As such, the blonde in the video was model Val Perry. The general public, though, wanted to know who the real Renee was. The ensuing media scuffle bumped interest in the song even further, allowing it to snatch Christmas number 1 in 1982 away from Shakin' Stevens.
Hello, blues, blue, blue, blue Christmas.
And when Lester was revealed to be Renee, there was additional intrigue.
I can't wait to hold and kiss you. Don't you know how much I miss you?
We got asked all the time if we were an item. I was 22 and he was 42, married with 2 children. And not being rude to Renato, but would he be a 22-year-old girl's fantasy? We had a ball, but he saw me as a child. Women fell at Renato's feet, believe me, but they were in their 30s and 40s. His behaviour was always exemplary.
In 1965, Vietnam seemed like just another foreign war.
While acid and Eurohouse would start infiltrating in the latter half of the decade, in 1985 electronic dance music wasn't present in the British charts. What changed that was English former hi-fi salesman Paul Hardcastle with his sample-heavy electro-documentary on the Vietnam War, 19.
It was 19. In Vietnam, it was 19.
Hardcastle found his way into dance music after a motorcycle accident. He spent his 18-month recovery listening to club radio, and energized by this music, swapped his video camera for a Mini Korg 700S synthesizer, and started working out how to play it. Once out of hospital, he played in a couple of Brit funk acts, both failing to impact the charts in a significant way. It was only when he went solo in 1984 that things started happening. He announced himself with a cover of D-Train's You're the One for Me.
Putting up on the cloud. Shout out now, you're the one for me. I stand up from the crowd. Shout out loud, you're the one for me.
But managed to make number 2 on the US dance chart with his instrumental 5th single, Rainforest. After this, he was signed to Chrysalis Records and acquired a young Simon Fuller, later of the Spice Girls and Pop Idol fame, as his manager. At the same time, an instrumental he had been working on still needed a hook. Musically, he had been inspired by the electro sound of Afrika Bambaataa. Building a danceable bed of sound with a Prophet 5 synth and a TR-808 drum machine. But it wasn't until one night when watching a documentary on the Vietnam War, they found what was missing. I was sitting here watching a program one night and I taped it. It really was a well-made documentary, and I knew there was a war, but I didn't know that the average age of soldiers was 19. I thought that was an incredibly low age, and that's what gave me the inspiration to make the record. Of course it's about the Vietnam War, but it's mainly about the fact that those kids were only 19 when they had to go and fight. After the financial windfall from Rainforest, Hardcastle had purchased an EMU emulator sampler and started playing around with it. With this, he sampled fragments of the tape documentary's voiceover, voiced by American broadcaster Peter Thomas, and rebuilt the narration to fit his track.
In World War II, the average age of the combat soldier was 26. In Vietnam, he was 19.
This new technology's limitations would make the song. Only able to sample a couple of seconds of audio at a time, the narrative was achieved by a few key phrases that could be repeated for emphasis.
In Vietnam, the combat soldier typically served a 12-month tour of duty.
Tapping a button on the word 19 gave the track its stuttered hook.
19.
His label was confused by the track. Radio was hesitant to play it, but DJ Tony Blackburn opened the floodgates when he played it on his London radio show. In those days, Radio 1 wouldn't touch dance music, and a record with someone talking about kids dying seemed like a recipe for disaster. But it was 1985, and the 10th anniversary of the end of the war was suddenly all over the media. I found myself on the ITN News being interviewed by Alistair Stewart. You couldn't ask for better exposure.
19.
His video also borrowed from the Vietnam Requiem documentary, cut up by Ken Grunbaum to complement the track. 19 reached number 1 in May 1985 and remained there for 5 weeks. Different mixes with re-edits of the video that aired on Top of the Pops helped maintain interest in the track.
None of them received a hero's welcome. None of them received a hero's welcome. None of them received a hero's welcome.
At the same time blocking one of the biggest bands in the world at the time, Duran Duran, from getting a number 1 with A View to a Kill. Starting its endless run on BBC One in February 1985, EastEnders was the anti-Coronation Street, BBC rather than ITV, South rather than North, and often soul-crushingly bleak compared to Corrie's moments of light-hearted comedy. Because of the BBC's no advertisement remit, EastEnders was never a soap opera in the conventional sense. It never had a corporate sponsor, and wasn't trying to sell you anything, unless you count the actors' pop careers in 1986. First came Anyone Can Fall in Love, Anita Dobson's vocal version of the show's theme tune, which sailed to number 4 in August.
Anyone can fall in love, but you must make.
Then in November, Letitia Dean and Paul J. Medford went number 12 with the teen pop of Something Out of Nothing.
Gonna make something out of nothing. Have to take a chance to win.
But in between was Nick Berry with Every Loser Wins, and number 1 in October.
Every loser wins once the dream begins.
The fresh-faced Berry played Simon Wixie Wix, introduced in October 1985, and hired in part to shoulder some of the more adult storylines after another actor had left the show prematurely. But also they wanted him to be part of an arc featuring the Square's younger characters, forming a band called The Band. My agent phoned me up and said, "I don't think you're right for it, but go along anyway." They wanted somebody who could play an instrument. I used to play keyboards in a band, which is what I told them, but I think they wanted a pianist. As it is, it's worked out alright. On the show, the band was a non-starter, undone like most other groups by arguments and egos. In the aftermath, Wixie was found in the Queen Vic, playing the in-canon self-penned Every Loser Wins on the pub piano.
Nothing is certain in a changing world.
His former bandmates looking on in a mixture of jealousy and disgust.
Just shows how right I was to give you the elbow. Music to vomit by.
What's all this, Simon?
In reality, written by EastEnders theme composer Simon May, the studio version of this lightweight ballad would be forced to the top of the charts a week later.
Every loser wins once the dream begins.
Being tied to one of the most watched shows on British television, as well as having the radio heft of the BBC behind them, made Every Loser Wins the second biggest single of 1986, behind the Communards. However, Berry was a bit sheepish about his moment in the pop spotlight. "I feel utter shame about my singing. I refused to do Top of the Pops, I was so embarrassed, and had to make some terrible video instead. I think I'll stick to acting."
We nearly made it. But suddenly
After leaving doo-wop group Billy Ward and his Dominoes, Jackie Wilson announced himself as a solo artist with Reet Petite in November 1957.
well, look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that. Ooh, wee.
A brass-led rock and roll modelled barn burner, Wilson's vocal gymnastics showcased every trick in the book.
She's so fine, and she's so fine, fine, fine.
Including brass mirroring whoops. And the chorus's forceful rolled R's. It launched his stellar chart career in the States.
Lonely teardrops, my pillow never dry. Higher, higher and higher. Get the sweetest feeling, honey, the sweetest.
Reet Petite is undeniably the most important song on this list. One of its songwriters, Berry Gordy, saw how little he is making from Wilson's hits, and moved to produce and release records on his own label, forming Tamla Motown in 1959. Wilson's life, though, was filled with mischances and despair, often for his own doing. His relationships with women led him to be married multiple times, with 6 children, alongside numerous affairs, and in 1961 was shot twice by a former girlfriend. Despite his chart success, he was broke, failed to pay his tax or child support, and was running on mostly amphetamines and alcohol. In 1975, he collapsed on stage from a heart attack while performing with the Dick Clark Revue in New Jersey, hitting his head as he fell to the floor. He remained in an unresponsive state for the next 9 years until his death in January 1984. And almost 3 years later, he got his first UK #1, at Christmas no less. The UK for the most part hadn't appreciated Jackie Wilson's music, as much as in the States. There he had a formidable collection of top 20 singles. In the UK he managed only a handful, but he did have fans. His records were Northern Soul staples, and in 1972 Van Morrison wrote Jackie Wilson Said in tribute, his first line nodding to his debut single.
Jackie Wilson said it was written tea.
Then, a decade later in 1982, Dexy's Midnight Runners got a top 5 hit covering that song. Is this gradual groundswell of influence how Wilson got to Christmas #1? No. London-based animators Giblets made an impressive, if silly claymation video, synced to Reet Petite. And it was broadcast on BBC Arts programme Arena in late 1986. Renewed interest led to a single re-release, led to it getting to #1 at the end of December 1986. For a long time, Reet Petite held the title for the slowest journey to UK #1, 29 years since its original release. But Kate Bush with Running Up That Hill has since claimed that title, it being 37 years between its 1985 release and getting to #1 in 2022. Rare for a novelty act, the Firm were not a one-hit wonder. Formed around John O'Connor and Graham Lister, they first appeared on the UK charts in 1982, where they ascended to #14 with Arthur Daly, He's Alright, a rapid-fire comedic tribute to the character from British TV mainstay, Minder. They even made it onto Top of the Pops. But after some flop follow-ups, they disappeared until 1987. O'Connor had been at a Civil War reenactment, and around the campfire had overheard Cavalier Rory Kehoe singing a decidedly not kayfabe parody of the traditional song The Music Man.
Pia, pia, piano, piano, the piano. Pia, pia, piano, pia, piano.
But instead of iterating different musical instruments for each new verse, he used different poorly remembered catchphrases from sci-fi series Star Trek. Intrigued, O'Connor asked if he could release his own version. Scrapping the Music Man melody, he swapped in London Bridge is Falling Down.
It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, not as we know it. It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, Captain.
With various friends and family members taking on the roles of Uhura, Spock, Bones, Kirk, and Scotty.
You cannot change the laws of physics. Laws of physics. Laws of physics. You cannot change the laws of physics. Laws of physics, Jim.
Accelerating the melody as the song progressed.
Oh, we come in peace, shoot to kill, shoot to kill, shoot to kill. We come in peace, shoot to kill. Scotty, beam me up.
O'Connor's Californian wife adopted the role of Uhura and was deeply embarrassed by her contribution, which is now seen as one of the most mimetic parts of the song. Star Trekkin' was undeniably catchy, but they had to self-release on their own label Bark, after being rejected by everyone else. The 20 or 30 companies that we offered it to all laughed at us and said, "You must be joking, we're not going to release this as a single." But I believed in it so much that I had to get it out there. So I started this little record company, released 500 copies, and it slowly picked up. Then suddenly it went haywire, and in 1987 it became a #1 hit in the UK, Europe, Australia and Japan. Its puppets and stop motion video with potato face crew members was forced into production due to Top of the Pops. The Firm, now in their 30s, felt that their bolding presence on the national chart show would ruin the fun. After the Spitting Image team weren't able to work to their tight time frame, they went with a bunch of untested art school graduates who crunched out the video on a minimal budget in a week, completed hours before the Thursday evening deadline.
Trekking across the universe.
Star Trekkin' was not the only sci-fi TV affiliated UK #1 of the 80s. 2 months later, T'Pau hit the top with China in Your Hand. Their unusual name taken from a character in Star Trek. While in June 1988, the KLF, in the guise of the Time Lords, got to number 1 by affixing the Doctor Who theme to Rock and Roll Part 2 for Doctoring the TARDIS. When he first appeared on most music fans' radars in 1983, amongst the maximalist new romanticism of Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet, Billy Bragg stood out. A socialist in the time of Thatcher, an imageless one-man Clash performing with only his guitar and untutored voice, a regular sight at protests and benefits. On his only other top 20 hit of the 80s, Between the Wars from March 1985, he sang of unions, the working class and austerity, the proceeds from which went to the Striking Miners Fund.
In time of austerity with sweat at the foundry between the wars.
But how did this starkly uncommercial and political act get a number 1 single 3 years later? In 1988, the NME released a charity compilation to raise funds for child counselling hotline, Childline, called Sgt. Pepper Knew My Father. It features a dozen enemy-friendly acts reinterpreting the songs from the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's, giving us the full tackling A Day in the Life.
Woke up, got out of bed, dragged a comb across my hair.
And Sonic Youth obliterating Within You Without You. Bragg had a go at She's Leaving Home with pianist Cara Tivy.
Quietly turning the back door key, stepping outside, she is free.
To promote this LP, they packaged Bragg's cover as a double A-side with Wet Wet Wet's Sophistopop version of With a Little Help from My Friends. Though in theory an NME band, as they're named after a Scritti Politti lyric.
It's time choking wet, wet with tears.
The Wets' debut had spawned a trio of top 10 singles, and with their dreamy good looks, have found themselves plastered all over teenage bedroom walls. Their clout dragged Bragg to the top of the charts, and top of the pops.
She's leaving home after living alone for so many years.
There was a goal to be achieved in promoting Childline, and I think Childline is an important thing to be involved in. I feel very strongly about it. I mean, it was non-party political. I didn't feel uncomfortable about it at any point until we were on Top of the Pops. I didn't feel uncomfortable meeting Wet Wet Wet. I didn't feel uncomfortable being on an album for the NME. It wasn't until I got on Top of the Pops that I really felt very uncomfortable. I found it all a bit humiliating. The whole trivialization of pop up at that end of the market. On its first week of 4 at number 1, Bragg and Tivy played their redo of She's Leaving Home, live at Bragg's insistence.
Wednesday morning, 5 o'clock as the day begins.
It wasn't until rehearsal that he realised he hadn't memorised the lyrics, so taped them on a sheet of paper at his feet if needed. When his moment in the spotlight came, he was foiled by the show's liberal use of dry ice, obscuring his safety net.
Something in love after living alone for so many years.
Billy Bragg never had another top 10 single. Conversely, Wet 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 had one of the longest stays at number 1 in the history of the British charts.
I feel it in my finger, I feel it in my toe.
The singer, mononymously known as Enya, first came to the music world's attention as one of the sisters in Irish folk family band Clanat, though left just prior to their breakthrough, theme from Harry's Game in 1982. After an ultimatum over a family member's alleged alcohol dependency, Enya left to collaborate with the group's former manager, Nicky Ryan, and his wife, Roma. Together, they would form the creative core of Enya's music, Nicky producing, Roma writing lyrics, and Enya supplying the music and melodies. Initially, they found success with more soundtrack work. The first Enya projects were for the full-length feature, The Frog Prince, and the 1987 BBC series, The Celts. While the songs were a beautiful mix of traditional and alien, it was the production that made them shine. Based on the work of Phil Spector and Brian Wilson, Nicky wove a lush mix of synthetic textures and reverbed walls of Enya harmonies. Nicky had this idea for years and years of using the voice as an instrument, not just layering string parts, but he knew I had a great love of harmony, and he said, what would it be like to have the same voice? What would evolve? The only way to know would be to actually record it. Critics weren't sold, not least because it was impossible to clearly categorize. Close but not quite the art pop of Kate Bush and Cocteau Twins, the electronic soundtracks of Tangerine Dream and Vangelis, and a step beyond the Celtic tradition of Clannad. But head of Warner Records Europe, Rob Dickens, was enraptured and signed the project, less because he felt they would sell, but because he wanted to hear more. When I signed Enya, her manager-producer Nicky Ryan said, "You're not going to push us for singles, are you?" It wasn't that kind of music. After we'd made the Watermark album, I said as a joke, "Nicky, where's the single?" A week later, Nicky rang up and said, "We've got it." Got what? We've got the single. Orinoco Flow was not complete when first revealed to Dickens. It lacked a middle eight and its lyrics needed to be fleshed out. But there was something about this propellant, shimmering instrumentation, the stacks of glistening vocals, that might work on radio. Though elsewhere she would sing in Gaelic, Latin, Welsh, Elvish, and the invented Loxian language, here Enya emotes in English, a journey across the ocean, its chorus being most distinguishable. So hard to make out, Dickens didn't realise he was shouted out until it started getting played on Radio 1. It was so remarkably different that listeners couldn't help but buy in, and Orinoco Flow hit number 1 in October 1988. Since then, Enya has never toured, rarely played live, and yet has sold 75 million albums worldwide. She has released 8 albums in almost 40 years, records only when her muse hits her. Meanwhile, is one of Europe's richest musicians, living in an actual castle in South Dublin, and is very much living her best life. By the end of the 1980s, 50s nostalgia was in full effect. The silent generation were looking back and buying back their youth. The first gasps of rock and roll were in conversation again, due to Back to the Future, and the chart success of Reet Petite, and the Elvis referencing Shakin' Stevens. Even Cliff Richard's Living Doll had become a number 1 twice over, with the help of the young ones. And it was in this climate that Jai Bunny and the Master Mixers appeared. Music Factory was a Yorkshire-based DJ service owned by John Pickles and his son, Andy. Their main product was a subscription service that supplied wedding and events DJs with party mega mixes, mixtapes with current hits and classics, with all the transitions and effects already in place. One of these mixes, compiled by Doncaster DJ Les Hemstock, was getting a particularly great reaction. Swing the Mood was a medley of early rock and roll singles, Bill Haley, Little Richard and Elvis. Stitched together with In the Mood by Glenn Miller, an incongruous big band hit from 15 years before rock and roll. John decided why not release it as a single. Maybe it'd go top 40. Hemstock and Andy then spent several weeks resplicing the track together to a drum machine beat while sourcing less financially crippling recordings. and hiring an Elvis impersonator for commercial release. The track was then released under the moniker Jive Bunny, with a music video consisting of post-war footage, with the occasional animated appearance of a cartoon rabbit. It was the most barefaced, obvious attempt at reselling the past in 80s pop, despised by teenagers and 20-somethings, but it sold boatloads to their target markets. Kids hooked onto it because it was a cartoon rabbit. The drunken populace viewed it as a party record, and mums and dads remembered the old tunes. People said we just stuck records together, but we were splicing tapes with scissors, creating the first mashups. Jive Bunny's first 3 singles ended up topping the charts. Swing the Mood in August 1989, The Rock and Roll Meets Hawaii 5-0 of That's What I Like in October, and the Christmas-themed glam of Let's Party in December. Let's party! A feat only previously achieved by Jerry and the Pacemakers and Frankie Goes to Hollywood. By their 4th single, The Gimmick had tired itself out. March 1990's That Sounds Good to Me, reaching only number 4.
Get your dancing shoes on and welcome to the rock and roll dance party.
That felt like a bit of a conspiracy. I don't think they wanted a rabbit to have the record for the first 4 singles going to number 1. Let's Party by Jive Bunny and the Master Mixes was one of the last number 1s of the 80s, but it wasn't at all representative of what we think of when we think of the decade. The 80s was a time of musical innovation, of excess, of charity, and an MTV-fueled focus on image. A decade of synth pop, new romanticism, hair metal, hip hop, and acid house. But at its most bizarre, it was a decade that reveled in novelty, nostalgia, and stop-motion music videos. There are some recurring themes that play out in these songs. Record companies not getting it, the fading power of the radio DJ, and the continued impact of television. But more than anything, they all convinced the British public to buy, making them all, for a week or 4, the biggest song in the country. Thanks for watching. So what other bizarre 80s number 1s do you think I missed? Comment down below. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and why don't you also share it with a couple of people? It really does help. As always, I'd like to shout out this month's new top tier supporters over on Patreon, Leaf Me Laugh and Uvin. And thanks to everyone else that supports me. And I will see you in a few weeks for a look into 90s punk.